All right, we are on our third exercise, and it's called the intentional focus exercise. And I asked you to take a photo of nothing in particular, in focus, and then take the same photo out of focus. And the only goal was to make it a little bit more visually interesting out of focus than it is in focus. So I have two different examples here of the same thing, just different ways of making it out of focus. The first, this is just shooting a poster on a bulletin board, right? So the first example, shooting it in focus and then using the focus lock technique. So shooting this and then zooming in on this, but instead of taking the picture, just focus locking, which means pushing the shutter release halfway down until it's locked in focus. I just pushed it a little bit too hard and got a picture. This is in macro mode. While it's in focus, or when it's locked rather, in macro mode, and then I frame up the shot this way, it becomes out of focus. So that's called focus locking. And that looks a little bit different than this one. Because in focus locking, you see how it gave me a lot more light. Whereas this is just taking this original exposure, which doesn't have a lot of light, but you can see all the even gradations. And then just, if you have manual focus capabilities on your camera, like I do on my SLR, I can manually take it out of focus. So it gives you very similar results. Just by focus locking, the reason this has more light is because it not only locked the focus, it also locked the light reading from being up close in macro mode. And so it just allowed for more light to come in when I took it from a distance. But I generally like more light in out of focus shots. So I think focus locking is a really good technique, because the blur tends to wash things out anyway. So the light is needed to even them out. So that's really the only difference between these two techniques, either manually putting it out of focus or focus locking it out of focus. Now, why do I think this is more interesting? This is all subjective, but I think this feels like stained glass, it feels cloudy, feels like maybe celestial, northern lights kind of clouds and reflections, whereas this is just what it is, because of all of its sharp edges. So this has more artistic possibilities for me to play with. Okay, so what are we going to do with these? Well, let me show you the other option I did. So I took this shot, not focusing now on focus lock or aperture, but focusing instead on shutter speed. And then you can also create out of focus effects through motion blur. And motion blur is just allowing the shutter to be open long enough that if you move the camera a lot, or you're shooting something that's moving, it will blur the subject. So now I need to decide, do I like this better? Kind of looks like it's on fire, so that's pretty cool. It's nice when you pick things that have dramatic contrast in them, either light, dark contrast, or in this case, color contrast, orange and blue. Or do I like this out of focus better? What do you guys think? Do you like the motion blur out of focus or the all over out of focus?
Focus lock out of focus.
All right, we got to vote for this one.
The motion blur.
I like the motion blur. I think because I did motion blur last time though, maybe I don't know. Maybe I'll do them both. We got time. So now, these are my two exemplars, right? Here is your challenge. We are going to upload those right to PhotoBucket along with our in-focus exposure. So that's no problem. Now your challenge is what we can do in Photoshop. So I want you to open up your in-focus exposure in Photoshop. Now the challenge is, can I make it match? We'll start with this one. So I'm just going to open this up in preview by double-clicking it. My out of focus exposure. So what tools do I have in Photoshop in processing to take focus away? Oh, where'd that one go? Want that one later. Preview's being really weird. Let me start it over. Okay, so I want this to look like this through processing. Is there any way? Well, yeah, I'll deal with that later. Okay, so you are able to take focus away in Photoshop, but you're going to see how it's not quite as, it's not exactly the same as taking it away with your lens. So this is what you do. First, we're going to make a duplicate of your background layer. We do that with Command J. Then we are going to go up to filters for the first time. So it's at the top of the screen, filter. And the only filter we'll ever use in this photography class for our regular assignments is under blur. There's actually two different blurs we'll use. For now, Gaussian blur. It's just a straightforward blur tool. Gaussian blur gives you a radius slider that asks you how many pixels you want it to blur together. And you can see if you push it all the way to the extreme, it becomes almost one solid color. And that's the average color of your photo. And for those programs that use multiple photographs and then make a bigger picture out of them, that's what it's doing. It's measuring the pixels and then averaging out the color of those pixels and then using that as a color pixel in a larger picture. But here we don't want to go to that extreme. We are trying to match what we already shot. So even though the light reading doesn't match, let's see if I can match that level of out of focusness. So that looks pretty close, right? So I say OK, and now I have it in focus and out of focus. And of course this one's a little bit brighter because this is the one I used with the macro focus lock. Let's see if it matches with the one that I just used, the manual. Because the lighting should be identical in this one. And you'll notice they're not quite exactly the same. On the projector, you're not seeing them quite clearly enough. But you'll notice maybe in your own computer with your own shots, if you made yours out of focus in this way, you'll notice that with your camera, you get more distinct little halos of focus, like ripples in a pond. There's almost a shape to it. Whereas when you just use Gaussian blur, everything is equally soft. It's kind of eerily soft. So it's somewhat less natural. So I always try to get my focus effects in the exposure if it's important to my vision. But you are able to take focus away pretty effectively. All right, now I'm going to make another duplicate of my background, and I'm going to see if I can match the motion blur. And now we get into some other blur features, which we probably won't use again, but are fun to play with for today. So here I was shaking the camera up and down, and you can see that in the motion blur. And I love it because it looks like it's on fire. So here I'm going to go to Filter Blur. This is another duplicate of my background layer. Filter Blur, Motion Blur. And again, I have a slider, but this time it's for the distance. And I have an angle. So if I'm going up and down, I want to set that angle to be about 90 degrees up and ground. But that distance is far too much. So let me lessen that. Maybe just a little bit more than that. Okay. And then you try to make those two match. And that's if you took something out of focus through a motion blur. Now the problem with this is with the filter for motion blur, it's very limited. It can only go in one direction, right? Whereas when you actually shake the camera, your camera might actually be at an arc. It might go slightly faster in some parts than other parts. And you can see there's a little bit more wiggle to mine than this. There's a little bit more dynamic blurring, especially in this area here, than you can see here. But you can see it does a pretty good job mimicking that. So what is the lesson? The lesson is that the computer can take focus away. The computer cannot add focus. Because we did this, go ahead and save it. We took focus away two different ways. We'll call this Carl exercise 3. Save it as a Photoshop file to the desktop. But if I try to do the reverse, and I open up an out of focus exposure in Photoshop, like so, make a duplicate of it, and try to match what it looks like in focus, squeeze this all onto one frame if I can. Let's see what tools I have. So I've made a duplicate, and on that duplicate I go to Filter, I go to Blur. Sorry, I don't go to Blur, I go to Sharpen. And my favorite sharpen tool is Smart Sharpen. It gives you a lot of sliders, a lot of control. We can actually remove the Gaussian blur. So how much? Well, it looks like we need to remove a lot of it. So let's push these all the way to the edges and see what it does. All right. I say OK. Filters can take a little while because they're processing every pixel according to some programmer's idea of what it means to sharpen or to blur. But in this case, there's a dramatic difference between that image and this image. But all the sharpening is able to do is to increase the contrast between pixels that it knows are already pretty different from each other. It tries to detect edges, like it can really darken the edge around the poster. But does it look anything like this? No. There's no way it can get that content if you don't give those pixels to the computer in the first place. So what is the lesson? The computer is great at taking away focus. It's really bad at trying to add it back. So when we get our exposures, one of the things we have to be sure to be very mindful of is that we are getting what we want in focus. And if anything, we want to make the error of getting too much in focus, because then we can always take it out in processing should we need to. Now what I find interesting is by adding sharpness back, that looks a little bit more where was it? Like my focus lock exposure.